Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. What truly lies behind the name of Michelangelo? This video is not merely a collection of textbook facts, but the living story of a man whose life was filled with struggle, doubt, and great discoveries. You will learn how Michelangelo, born into an ordinary family, became the man entrusted with shaping the very image of Rome, why the tomb of a pope turned into the work he considered a curse, what truly stood behind the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel, rejection, doubt, and 4 years of exhausting labor, and what he was like in his final years, an architect, a poet, a man who worked until his last breath, still searching for meaning. This is the story of how one name changed an entire era and continues to inspire the world even 5 centuries later. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. In the very heart of Tuscany, in a small town called Caprese, surrounded by hills and olive groves, on the morning of March 6th, 1475, a child was born whose name would forever be written in the history of art and humankind. His name was Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni. That day, in the house of the Podestà, the local magistrate and governor, life flowed as usual. No one present could have imagined that here began the path of one of the greatest masters of the Renaissance. The newborn's father, Lodovico di Leonardo Buonarroti Simoni, belonged to an old Florentine family that had long since lost its former wealth and influence. Though their name still carried weight, their finances were poor. Lodovico held the post of Podestà in Caprese, a civil administrator and judge, and lived there with his wife, Francesca di Neri del Miniato di Siena, a woman of more modest origin. It is believed that Francesca was already in frail health, and soon after the birth of her son, a wet nurse was required to care for him. As an infant, Michelangelo was sent to be nursed in the village of Settignano, near Florence, where the nurse lived with her husband, a marble worker, either a stonecutter or a sculptor, depending on the source. Michelangelo would later recall this with a smile, saying that he had absorbed his love for marble in the chisel with his nurse's milk. The village of Settignano was famous for its stonecraft, and though it is impossible to say how much the boy consciously remembered, the symbolic connection between that place and his destiny has long fascinated historians. When the boy was about 6 years old, the family returned to Florence, a city already living under the sign of the Renaissance. Palaces were adorned with stucco and frescoes, churches and chapels were being built, and the arts and sciences were blooming. There, surrounded by beauty, Michelangelo grew up. What others passed by without noticing, he studied as secret lessons. Florence was full of workshops where painters, goldsmiths, and sculptors worked in open view of the public. Michelangelo's father, despite his noble ancestry, looked down upon art. Dreaming of an administrative career for his son, perhaps as a notary or civil servant, he considered art beneath the dignity of their family. Yet Michelangelo's passion for drawing appeared early. According to Giorgio Vasari, his first biographer, the boy drew with charcoal on walls and scraps of paper, copying what he saw around him. Lodovico did not approve. One day, catching his son drawing, he destroyed the sketch in anger and even struck him. But the boy's talent was too strong to suppress. Finally, persuaded by Michelangelo's older brother Leonardo, Lodovico agreed to allow his son to study art. Thus, at about 13 years of age, Michelangelo was apprenticed to Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of Florence's leading painters. This event, crucial to his future, will be the subject of the next chapter. For now, the boy continued to teach himself by observing and sketching in churches and studying architectural details. He was especially drawn to the human form, to the tension of muscles and the stillness of motion, the silent language of the body. There is also a well-known episode from his youth, a fight with Pietro Torrigiano, a fellow student. Torrigiano, hot-tempered and jealous, struck Michelangelo so violently that he broke his nose. The disfigurement remained for life, giving Michelangelo's face the sternness so often noted in portraits. Yet even this did not shake his resolve. Thus passed his early years, immersed in light, form, and discipline. He had not yet made a name for himself, but he was already learning from a city that itself was a living museum, where the works of Brunelleschi, Donatello, and Botticelli stood as silent teachers. In these streets and workshops, under the arcades and church shadows, Michelangelo began the journey that would lead him to immortality. At 13, Michelangelo's father finally yielded to the obvious. His son showed no interest in law, trade, or bureaucracy. His calling was art. And so, Lodovico placed him in the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of the most respected masters of Florence. Michelangelo entered the workshop in 1488. Ghirlandaio was famous for his frescoes in the Tornabuoni Chapel of Santa Maria Novella and provided solid, practical training. Apprentices began by preparing canvases, grinding pigments, and gilding, long before being allowed to paint. Michelangelo followed this path but soon revealed unusual gifts: a keen eye, a hand of precision, and a rare ability to see the structure beneath the surface. According to Vasari, within months, Ghirlandaio trusted him with real fresco details, remarkable for a boy his age. Impressed by his skill and discipline, Ghirlandaio recommended him for further study at the Medici Garden, an academy founded by Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. The garden, near the monastery of San Marco, housed antique statues and reliefs collected by the Medici family. There, young artists could copy and learn from classical masterpieces. In 1489, Ghirlandaio introduced Michelangelo to Bertoldo di Giovanni, a sculptor and curator of the collection who had been a pupil of Donatello. Under Bertoldo's guidance, Michelangelo began to sculpt seriously, working with marble and chisel for the first time. One of his earliest surviving works was the relief, The Battle of the Centaurs, inspired by a mythological story suggested by the poet Angelo Poliziano, a close associate of Lorenzo. The relief displayed astonishing maturity, an intertwining of bodies, movement, and tension far beyond his years. Even unfinished, it showed the power and boldness that would define his style. So impressed was Lorenzo that he invited the young sculptor to live in his palace, an extraordinary honor. There, Michelangelo mingled daily with the finest minds of Florence: Marsilio Ficino, the translator of Plato, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, philosopher and writer, and many others who discussed art, reason, and the nature of the soul. Historians agree that these years shaped Michelangelo's worldview, merging artistic mastery with philosophical thought. Lorenzo supplied him with tools, marble, and even financial aid to his father, a gesture of generosity that ensured the boy's freedom to create. At the Medici court, Michelangelo also witnessed how art and power intertwined, how sculptures and frescoes were not mere ornaments, but instruments of prestige, proclaiming the glory of Florence and the Medici name. This understanding of art's political dimension would follow him throughout his life. The years spent in Lorenzo's palace were few, yet decisive. After Lorenzo's death in 1492, Florence fell into political turmoil. Still, Michelangelo often recalled that under Lorenzo, he first felt himself not a student, but a true artist. After Lorenzo de' Medici's death in 1492, Florence changed. The rise of Girolamo Savonarola brought moral austerity and hostility toward luxury and art. Michelangelo stayed for a time, but soon longed for broader horizons. In 1496, at the age of 21, he left for Rome, the city of great commissions and classical ruins. There, he first worked for Cardinal Raffaele Riario, who commissioned a statue of Bacchus, the Roman god of wine. The figure, slightly intoxicated and crowned with grape leaves, was considered too sensual for the cardinal's taste, but was purchased by Jacopo Galli, a Roman banker and early patron of Michelangelo. The statue, preserved today in Florence's Bargello Museum, already showed his command of anatomy and vitality. Through Galli, Michelangelo received the commission that would change his life: the Pietà for the French King's Chapel in St. Peter's Basilica. The order came from Cardinal Jean Belair de la Graulas, ambassador of France to the papal court. The contract was signed in August 1498, when Michelangelo was not yet 24. He personally traveled to Carrara to choose marble, then returned to Rome to work tirelessly for months. The folds of the Virgin's robe, the lifeless yet serene body of Christ, all bore his relentless pursuit of perfection. Michelangelo made Mary strikingly young, symbolizing not her earthly age but the eternal purity of the soul, a choice that sparked debate yet revealed his spiritual vision. When completed in 1499, the Pietà caused a sensation. Crowds came to see it, and, as Vasari tells, when Michelangelo overheard two men attributing the sculpture to another artist, he returned that night and carved his name across the Virgin's sash: Michelangelus Buonarrotis Florentinus Facibat. Michelangelo Buonarroti of Florence made this. It was the only work he ever signed. After the Pietà, Michelangelo's fame spread far beyond Rome. Returning to Florence around 1501, he received a monumental task: to carve David from a damaged block of marble that had lain unused since 1464. Other sculptors had abandoned it, calling it flawed. Michelangelo accepted the challenge. From September 1501 to early 1504, he worked alone, concealing his progress. He envisioned not a triumphant giant, but a young man before battle, calm, tense, and resolute. When unveiled, the statue, over 5 meters tall with its pedestal, astonished the city. The council debated its placement, and it was finally set before the Palazzo Vecchio as a symbol of Florence's freedom and courage. The unveiling in spring 1504 was attended by Leonardo da Vinci, Sandro Botticelli, and others. David became an icon of Renaissance ideals, harmony, dignity, and human strength without arrogance. Soon followed new commissions, including the grand design for the fresco The Battle of Cassina in the Hall of the Great Council. Though never completed, his preparatory drawing, the famous cartoon depicting soldiers caught in motion, inspired countless artists afterward. By 1505, Michelangelo's name stood among the greatest of his age. Rome once again called for him, this time for a task that would test the limits of his genius: the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. By the beginning of 1505, Michelangelo Buonarroti, already recognized as one of the most outstanding sculptors of his time, arrived in Rome at the invitation of Pope Julius II. The original plan was the creation of a grand tomb for the pontiff himself, a project that envisioned hundreds of statues and a complex architectural composition. Yet almost immediately after work began, the Pope changed his priorities, and in 1508 he proposed a completely different task: to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The chapel itself had existed since the end of the 15th century. Its walls were adorned with frescoes by Botticelli, Perugino, Rosselli, and other masters depicting scenes from the lives of Moses and Christ, but the ceiling until then had been a simple starry sky on a blue field. Julius II wished to replace it with a more significant and meaningful program that would reflect the ideas of his pontificate. For Michelangelo, this proposal was unexpected, and at first, unwelcome. He considered himself a sculptor rather than a painter. Although he had experience with fresco, none of his previous projects approached this in scale. Letters and accounts survive in which he openly expressed doubts, insisting that such work would be a severe ordeal for him, and even suspecting that rivals, including the architect Donato Bramante and Raphael Sanzio, had encouraged the Pope in order to undermine his reputation. But Julius II, known for his persistence, did not back down. Michelangelo accepted the commission, and in May 1508 began preparations. One of the first tasks was devising a special scaffold structure. To avoid disrupting services and damaging the existing frescoes, Michelangelo designed wooden platforms fixed into the walls rather than resting on the floor. These scaffolds allowed him and his assistants to move along the vault and work standing with their heads thrown back. He did indeed hire assistants, mainly Florentine painters, but soon dismissed most of them, dissatisfied with the quality of their work. From then on, Michelangelo executed the majority of the frescoes himself, using helpers only for technical tasks, preparing pigments, or laying the initial coats of plaster. The initial subject plan envisioned images of the apostles, but Michelangelo quickly proposed a far more complex and ambitious program: 9 scenes from Genesis, including the creation of the world, the creation of Adam, the creation of Eve, the fall, and the flood, as well as figures of prophets, sibyls, and the genealogy of Christ. This transformed the ceiling from mere decoration into a theological encyclopedia expressed through images and the movement of figures. Work proceeded with great difficulty. Michelangelo often wrote to his brother and friends complaining of physical suffering. Standing on the scaffolds with his head tilted back, he endured constant pain in his neck and back. His arms went numb. His eyes grew inflamed from dripping paint and lime. In one letter, he wryly described his contorted posture and even added a humorous self-portrait. In spite of the torment, he continued. He repeatedly paused the work, driving the Pope to despair. Julius II demanded faster progress, sent messengers and letters, and even came in person to the chapel to inspect. History records an episode when the impatient Pope climbed the scaffolding to see what the artist was doing. Michelangelo, unwilling to show unfinished work, brusquely asked him to descend and not interfere. The Pope, surprisingly for his temper, put up with it, a testament to his respect for the master's talent. The project took about 4 years. Individual sections were uncovered gradually, but the official unveiling of the entire ceiling took place on October 31st, 1512. The result stunned contemporaries. Not only the grandeur of the conception impressed them, but also the mastery of execution. every figure seemed alive, full of hidden movement and spiritual force. The scene of the creation of Adam inspired particular awe. The hand of the Creator reaching toward the hand of man became a symbol for European culture as a whole, and even today, that fragment is most often recalled when people speak of the Sistine Chapel. Chronicles and letters from those years report that visitors entered the chapel and stood for long periods with their heads thrown back, striving to make out every figure and every detail. There is testimony that Raphael, having seen Michelangelo's work, was so impressed that he revised his own style, a change visible in his subsequent paintings. Michelangelo himself, despite universal admiration, felt primarily fatigue and disappointment. He wrote repeatedly to friends and patrons that the work had been a torture rather than a pleasure, and declared he would prefer to return to sculpture, which he regarded as his true vocation. His letters from that time reveal a sense of isolation. He spent almost all his time either in the chapel or in the workshop, avoiding the social life that swirled around the papal court. Nevertheless, it was thanks to the Sistine ceiling that Michelangelo's name was finally established not merely as that of a sculptor or painter, but as a universal master capable of embracing the greatest biblical themes and embodying them in forms that have not lost their power across the centuries. When the Sistine Chapel ceiling was completed in 1512, Michelangelo attained the status of an artist equal to any master in Italy. Yet his path did not grow easier. On the contrary, the years ahead were filled with frustrations, long disputes with patrons, and a constant struggle between artistic duty and political circumstance that afflicted the whole of Italy for decades. In February 1513, Pope Julius II died, the very pontiff who had entrusted Michelangelo with the Sistine ceiling and who, back in 1505, had commissioned the grand design for his tomb. From the beginning, the project was extraordinarily ambitious. At its center, a large statue of the Pope surrounded by allegorical figures, and around it, about 40 marble sculptures representing biblical prophets, virtues, and personifications such as strength or mercy. Over time, however, the project was reduced. After Julius II's death, the patrons renegotiated the terms, cutting the scale and the funding and moving the tomb from a central place in St. Peter's Basilica to a less prominent site in San Pietro in Vincoli. Michelangelo returned to this work again and again. He signed new contracts in 1513, 1516, 1526, and even 1542, yet constantly met with new delays, demands to reduce the number of statues, changes in the composition, or outright postponements. In letters from this period, he wrote bitterly that the tomb had become the misfortune of my life, referring less to the carving itself than to the endless legal and financial obstacles. Within the framework of this long project, around 1515 he completed one of his most famous sculptures, the Moses. Today, in San Pietro, in Vincoli, it is counted among the masterpieces of Renaissance sculpture, a powerful figure seated in tense poise, muscular arms, and an expressive face that shows not calm, but inner struggle, reflection, readiness to act. It is said that Michelangelo was unusually satisfied with this statue. He once struck it on the knee with his hammer and exclaimed, "Why do you not speak?" At the same time, Michelangelo was increasingly torn between Rome and Florence. In 1516, Pope Leo X of the Medici family proposed that he design a facade for San Lorenzo in Florence, the Medici family church where their ancestors were buried. The honor was great, but the complications began at once. The choice of marble, its transport from Carrara, the construction of scaffolding, and financial disputes between the papal court and the Florentine Signoria all slowed the project. In the end, despite years of preparation and many drawings, the facade was never built. Michelangelo made wooden models and developed plans, but the church remained without cladding, and to this day, the facade of San Lorenzo is unfinished. Meanwhile, Italy lived in constant anxiety. In 1527, Rome was sacked by the troops of Charles V, and already in 1529, the siege of Florence began, where Republican rule had returned after the expulsion of the Medici. At that time, Michelangelo sided with the Republicans and took part in organizing the city's defense. He was officially appointed chief of fortifications, and the artist who had recently created the image of Adam in the Sistine Chapel now designed bastions, ramparts, and fortified gates. Specific drawings of fortifications by Michelangelo survive, as do his letters to the Florentine authorities proposing technical solutions and warning of possible threats. Historical chronicles note that he personally inspected the walls, rode along the defenses, and oversaw construction. This activity continued until the city's capitulation in August 1530, when, after a long siege, the Republic fell and Medici rule was restored. After these events, Michelangelo was in danger. As a man associated with the Republican government, he feared reprisals and hid for several weeks in a secret room beneath the new sacristy of San Lorenzo. This tiny, almost subterranean space was discovered only in the 20th century. On its walls are preserved charcoal sketches of hands, heads, and figures that historians believe were made by Michelangelo during his concealment. Thanks to the intercession of friends and above all the influence of Pope Clement VII, also a Medici, Michelangelo escaped punishment and soon returned to work. But those months left a deep mark on his character. From then on he grew even more withdrawn, still less inclined to society, dedicating himself solely to labor. During these same years between 1530 and 1540, he created several important sculptures, including the figures for the Medici Chapel, Dawn, Dusk, Night, and Day, works that express with particular intensity the sense of time and movement, not in the serene poses of antique statuary, but in anxious, almost tormented lines of bodies and faces. These images seem to reflect the master's inner state, a man who had lived through wars, betrayals, and changes of power, yet still held the chisel and believed in the force of form. Alongside sculpture, Michelangelo turned increasingly to poetry. He wrote sonnets and letters reflecting on the meaning of art, on time, on faith, and on death. The poems that have come down to us read like a personal diary of someone who did not seek fame or honors, but strove to comprehend what was happening within and around him. By the middle of the 1540s, Michelangelo Buonarroti, then over 70, already possessed the reputation of Italy's greatest sculptor and painter. Yet a new stage began, the time when he became the chief architect of Rome, the man whose decisions would shape the city's visage for centuries to come. After the death of Antonio da Sangallo the Younger in 1546, Pope Paul III of the Farnese family appointed Michelangelo chief architect for the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, a project begun under Bramante and carried forward for several decades. At that moment, the basilica stood unfinished. The foundations were laid and the walls rising, but the design had shifted from architect to architect. The Pope decided that Michelangelo alone could bring clarity and resolution. Accepting the appointment, the master immediately set about revising the plans. He rejected many details added after Bramante, seeking to restore clarity and monumental simplicity. He reduced complicated adjuncts, strengthened the drum of the dome, and altered wall proportions so that the building would appear powerful and unified from every vantage point. Drawings in Michelangelo's own hand survive, showing his work on details of capitals, pilasters, arches, and window openings. Not ornament for ornament's sake, but harmony and expressiveness of form. Contemporaries recalled that he personally inspected the quality of each stone block, climbed the scaffolds despite his age, spoke with stonecutters to explain how to dress the surfaces, demonstrated calculations, and marked directly on the stone. The central task for Michelangelo was the dome, which would crown the whole structure and be visible from afar above the roofs of Rome. Bramante's project included a dome inspired by the forms of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence, but Michelangelo reworked it with new proportions. He strengthened the drum, increased wall thickness, and used a double shell, inner and outer, so the structure could bear its immense weight. He referred to the dome as a crown for the Apostle Peter, and considered it not merely an architectural feature, but a symbol of the unity of the Christian world. Letters from the time mention his uncompromising standards, demanding perfect precision from masons even in places invisible from the ground. In Michelangelo's lifetime, the dome rose to the level of the drum, but the structure was completed after his death. The architect Giacomo della Porta, following Michelangelo's designs, raised the vaults and finished the dome by 1590, preserving the master's essential proportions and intent. Thus, although Michelangelo never saw the result with his own eyes, the familiar appearance of St. Peter's owes its existence above all to him. In parallel, Michelangelo undertook another major Roman project, the remodeling of the Capitoline Hill. This work had begun in 1536 and continued for many years. Once the political center of ancient Rome, the hill had fallen into neglect by the 16th century and needed renewal. Paul III commissioned Michelangelo to create a new architectural ensemble uniting ancient tradition with contemporary ideals of beauty and order. Michelangelo designed a plan for the square that included the rebuilding of the facades of the Palazzo dei Conservatori, the Palazzo Nuovo, and the Palazzo Senatorio, as well as the placement at the center of the bronze equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, saved in the Middle Ages from being melted down due to the mistaken belief that it represented Constantine the Great. Michelangelo proposed a new pedestal and positioned the statue to become the focal point of the entire composition. He also designed the famous Coordinata staircase leading from the foot of the hill to the square, a gentle ascent suitable for riders as well as pedestrians, hence its name. Michelangelo created the star-patterned paving of the square as an intricate oval with radiating lines. The pavement was completed only in the 17th century, but strictly according to his drawings. Architectural historians note that these projects display the distinctive style of the late Michelangelo: severe, monumental, with emphasized verticals, deep niches, and restrained yet expressive decoration. In his letters, the master wrote that he considered excessive ornament idle chatter in stone, preferring clear, robust forms that would serve not only beauty, but also the dignity and strength of the city. Remarkably, despite immense responsibilities, Michelangelo continued to supervise every stage of the work personally, never entrusting the drawings entirely to students or assistants. Accounts describe how at day's end he would walk the construction sites, speak with stonecutters, explain fine points to workers, and at times climb the stairs and scaffolds himself to check the quality of the masonry. These years were a time of near total detachment from public life. He rarely attended festivities or gatherings, took no part in public disputes, and accepted almost no new commissions for sculpture or painting, focusing solely on the Basilica and the Piazza. His house in Rome became an architect's workshop. Everywhere lay drawings, models, stone samples, letters, and calculations. Thus passed the last decades of Michelangelo's life as the architect of the Eternal City. Amid marble, scaffolding, and plans, he shaped the visage of Rome, a visage that even after centuries still bears the mark of his genius. In the final years of his long life, Michelangelo Buonarroti, already renowned as a sculptor, painter, and architect, turned less often to marble or drawings and more often to words, which became his way to reflect on what mattered most: time, faith, and the human soul. The diary of his last decades was written not with a chisel but with a pen. In letters, sonnets, and poetic fragments he revealed that part of his nature which had long remained hidden behind the image of a stern master. Living in Rome from the early 1530s almost until his death, Michelangelo led a secluded life. His house in the Michelli dei Coronara quarter was filled not only with architectural drawings and models for St. Peter's Basilica, but also with stacks of paper. Among them were drafts of letters, jotted thoughts, and hundreds of sonnets and madrigals that he wrote for himself and for a small circle of friends. It is known that he began to write poetry in his youth, but he turned to it most actively after 70, when his body no longer allowed him to work with former strength, and his thoughts turned more often to questions of eternity and salvation. One of the central themes of Michelangelo's late poetry was repentance and meditation on the transience of art. He often repeated the idea that even the most perfect statue or the most beautiful church is as nothing before divine judgment. In one famous sonnet he wrote, "Neither paints nor chisel will save me from death. All that I have made turns to dust." A special place in this period was held by his friendship with Vittoria Colonna, a poet and noblewoman, widow of the Marquis of Pescara. Their correspondence and meetings lasted almost 10 years, from the late 1530s until her death in 1547. These were not mere social calls or literary exchanges. Vittoria and Michelangelo discussed questions of faith, the meaning of life, the nature of love, and repentance. Dozens of letters survive in which he shares his thoughts with her, shows new poems, and asks for counsel. According to tradition, in Vittoria's house he once left a drawing of the crucified Christ, executed with unusual restraint and profound simplicity. It is thought to be one of the few works Michelangelo created not for a patron, not for a republic or a pope, but for a close friend. After Vittoria Colonna's death, Michelangelo became even more withdrawn. In his letters of the 1550s, lines appear ever more often about how hard it was for him to find joy in former occupations. Yet he continued to labor. Until his final years he remained chief architect of St. Peter's, oversaw the raising of the dome, developed small details of facades and interiors, met with craftsmen, and issued instructions. A special page of his late work is the sculpture known as the Rondinini Pietà. He worked on it when he was almost blind in his studio during the last months of his life, and it represents a completely different approach from his early works. There are no ideal anatomical proportions, no meticulously polished surfaces. The figures of Christ and the Virgin are elongated, scarcely distinguishable, as if the master sought to express not the bodily but the spiritual, as though in his final days he tried to free himself from the material, leaving in stone only the echo of a thought. Witnesses of those years say that his home was constantly filled with pupils and assistants. Daniele da Volterra, later known for adding draperies to the nudes of the Last Judgment, Tiberio Calcagni, Francesco Amanati. They helped him not only in the workshop but also in daily life, bringing food, organizing correspondence, and managing business with patrons. Despite his advanced age, Michelangelo continued personally to visit the construction site of St. Peter's until the end. There is a documented note that in January 1564, a few weeks before his death, he was still issuing orders concerning the masonry of the dome, insisting on proper proportions, drawing plans and sketches with his own hand. Michelangelo died on February 18, 1564, in Rome, in his own house. In accordance with his last will, his body was secretly taken to Florence, where he was buried in the church of Santa Croce. On the tomb, designed by Vasari, allegorical figures of painting, sculpture, and architecture were placed, as if to emphasize that all three arts were united in a single life. The last years of Michelangelo became a time of personal searching, in which he gradually withdrew from the bustling world, remaining alone with thoughts of eternity and of God. In the letters and poems of that time, there sounds that very special voice which is not heard in marble and frescoes, but which makes the image of the master especially close and alive. The voice of a man who, having lived a long life full of trials, continued to seek truth until his very last day. After Michelangelo Buonarroti's death in 1564, his name did not dissolve into the procession of past ages. On the contrary, it began a new life, first in the memories of contemporaries, then in books, letters, and the works of those who came after him, and finally in the very visage of European cities, where the trace of his hand remained in stone, in paint, in lines and vaults. Almost immediately after his death, he was seen not merely as part of cultural heritage but as a symbol of genius itself. His biographer, Giorgio Vasari, one of his closest admirers, included Michelangelo's life and art in lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects, placing him in a special position as the culmination of Italian art, the summit toward which generations of masters had aimed. Vasari claimed that with Michelangelo, an entire era had come to its close. So grand and boundless did his contribution seem. Already in the first half of the 17th century, many masters tried to imitate his style, though none dared to declare himself his successor. His name was pronounced with a respect bordering on the ecclesiastical. In the workshops of Italy and France, artists and sculptors copied his figures, studied his anatomical drawings, and cast plaster replicas of his statues. Especially often, academies used copies of the David, the Moses, and details from the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel, which became a mandatory part of training for future artists. If in the 17th century his legacy became almost canonical, then in the 18th century the first disputes began. The Age of Enlightenment, with its drive toward rationality and moderation, regarded Michelangelo's expressive force with restraint. Critics of that time called his figures excessively tense, his architecture overly heavy, and his late works lacking in clarity. Nevertheless, even the most cautious aesthetes admitted that one could not do without Michelangelo. He was present in every conversation about beauty, a figure one might debate, but could not ignore. A true return to him came in the 19th century, when the Romantics, and later the Symbolists, discerned in his art something far deeper than form. They valued especially his inner tension and drama. In Germany, writers and philosophers such as Goethe and Schelling compared Michelangelo to titans of the spirit, while in France, sculptors like Auguste Rodin openly called themselves his pupils. Rodin once said that if humanity had to preserve a single sculpture, it should be Michelangelo's Moses, because within it are gathered everything: anger, reason, strength, and faith. In the 20th century, when traditional canons of art were reconsidered, interest in Michelangelo did not disappear, but merely changed direction. Modern architects studied his proportions, viewing St. Peter's as a work of genius in engineering. Modernist painters, including Picasso and Matisse, turned to his images to find in them a new language of form. Even in the abstract compositions of the 20th century, one easily recognizes echoes of that plastic force he instilled in his frescoes and sculptures. Michelangelo's very figure became almost mythical. In mass culture of the 20th and 21st centuries, he appears in films, novels, stage plays, and even comic books. His name has become synonymous with genius, just as the name Archimedes once became synonymous with science. And this interest has not been merely superficial. Art historians have published ever-new studies of his anatomical sketches, the meanings embedded in his frescoes, and the mysteries of his personal life, matters that to this day provoke debate and attempts at decipherment. Special attention in every era has been drawn to his late works, those in which he renounces outward brilliance, smooth surfaces, and the ideal. In the Rondanini Pietà, in the rough, almost unhewn silhouettes 20th century historians saw a breakthrough toward new art, what would later be called existential sculpture. It is this work that is most often mentioned in courses on contemporary art, alongside the works of Giacometti and Brancusi. In Italy, Michelangelo's name is bound forever not only to the museums that house his works, but to the very image of the country. Tourists who come to Florence, Rome, Milan go, not only for the atmosphere but also to encounter the man who, many centuries ago, took a chisel in hand to free from stone figures that do not grow old. The pilgrimage to the David in Florence, or to the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, is not only a cultural act, but almost a ritual, a touch of something greater than time. Thus Michelangelo's legacy has not merely been preserved, it has become part of our inner optics, of how we look at form, at scale, at the human being. His figures teach us not only to see, but to feel. Tension, striving, the unattainability of the ideal. His lines, full of doubt, remind us that behind outward power, there is always an inner struggle. Michelangelo's name does not fade today, not because textbooks remember him, but because it continues to speak to us, in the lines of architecture, in the gestures of sculpture, in the hush of museums, and in that clear astonishment that arises when we gaze into a face carved from stone and suddenly recognize in it something of ourselves.